Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive right into The Final Voyage, a forensic history of pirate demise. So, you know those romanticized treasure maps and the Hollywood pirate myths we all grew up with? Yeah, forget them. Today, we're literally tearing up the script. We're looking at the cold, hard, and let's be honest, decidedly morbid historical evidence of how the golden age of piracy actually hit a dead end. We're going to trace the final voyage of these infamous figures and figure out exactly what happened when the swashbuckling finally stopped.
Which brings us to the big question. How did history's most legendary pirates actually meet their end? I mean, we all know the names, right? But how did guys like Blackbeard and Captain Kidd actually die? When you peel back the layers of all that myth, their final moments were rarely filled with glory. Instead of, sailing off into the sunset with a hold full of gold, the reality is their ends were violent, desperate, and surprisingly well documented. Let's take a magnifying glass to these historical crime scenes and piece the real story together.
Section 1. The Hollywood Pirate Myth.
For decades, we've been sold this cinematic adventure. You know the drill. Swashbuckling heroes, endless rum, consequence-free rebellion. But we have to contrast that with the brutal reality of maritime law. The true story of 18th century maritime life is so much darker, governed by an absolutely unforgiving naval justice system. It wasn't about seeking out a fun high-seas romp, not at all. It was purely about surviving in a world that literally offered zero mercy. Moving on to Section 2, a failed economic venture. Because when it comes down to it, piracy was definitely not a cinematic adventure. It was a failed economic venture, and really a direct reaction to those brutal maritime laws we just mentioned. Piracy wasn't a career choice for thrill seekers. It was a desperate reaction to a totally broken system. Honest sailors were being pushed to the absolute brink. Punishing naval conditions, starvation wages, rampant diseases like scurvy. Hoisting the black flag, that was a high-stakes, largely doomed gamble by men who felt trapped in a machine built just to exploit them. It was a chaotic attempt to seize back a little control, even if they knew they were living on borrowed time. And that leads directly to a massive takeaway from the source material, reframing piracy not as a cinematic adventure, but as a failed economic venture or a reaction to brutal maritime laws. That reframing fundamentally shifts our entire perspective. These guys weren't anti-heroes on a joyride. They were participants in a doomed economic system, destined to collide head-on with the uncompromising fist of 18th century law enforcement. Look through that lens, and the whole narrative instantly flips from adventure right back to sheer desperation. That brings us to Section 3, Mechanics of Naval Combat. So this sheer desperation naturally forced them into intense conflict, bringing us to the boarding action. By definition, this was a brutal, close-quarters naval combat tactic used to physically capture an enemy vessel. There was absolutely no remote warfare back then. If you wanted to take a ship, you had to cross over onto it, look your enemy dead in the eye, and fight on a swaying, slippery wooden deck. It was chaotic, it was deafening, and it was incredibly lethal. And this tactical nightmare unfolds in 3 terrifying steps. First, you've got the cannon barrage. This wasn't just to sink the ship. The goal was to disable it and cause mass splintering, where these massive shards of wood act like deadly shrapnel. Second step, the grappling hooks. They deployed these to violently lock the 2 wooden verses together, so literally no one could escape. And finally, step 3, the close quarters boarding. This is where 18th century naval combat reaches its absolute, most grim, unavoidable climax, ending in just intense hand-to-hand violence. Which leads into Section 4, the grim medical reality. We have to talk about the devastating medical reality of wounds sustained during 18th century boarding actions. This is so far removed from cinematic glory, right? Where a character gets a neat little scratch on the arm and just keeps fighting. No way. In the 1700s, there were no antibiotics, no modern surgery, and definitely no anesthesia. Surviving the actual hand-to-hand combat often just meant you were left facing a slow, horrific demise from infection, gangrene, or a crude amputation performed by the ship's surgeon in the pitch dark. And finally, Section 5, How the Legends Died. When we apply all this to 2 of history's most infamous figures, Captain Kidd and Blackbeard, their fates perfectly map to these grim historical realities we've been unpacking. Take Captain Kidd. His cause of death was execution, demonstrating the ultimate, uncompromising consequence of brutal maritime law. He didn't go down in a blaze of glory. He died at the end of a rope, strung up basically as a giant warning sign to others. Blackbeard, on the other hand, died in naval combat.
His end serves as a terrifying, real-world example of the devastating medical reality of those combat wounds.
Just looking specifically at Blackbeard's demise for a second, the historical forensics here are absolutely staggering. He sustained a massive quantity of wounds before he finally dropped. He didn't just take a single dramatic sword thrust and fall over. The reality is way more gruesome. He absorbed over 20 distinct wounds, including at least 5 bullet holes and some incredibly severe sword cuts before collapsing to the blood-soaked deck. It wasn't some elegant duel. It was literally a sheer, brutal war of attrition on the human body.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. Does understanding the brutal economic and medical realities change your perception of these romanticized historical outlaws? Because honestly, when we swap out the Hollywood myth for the hard facts, the failed economic ventures, the uncompromising maritime laws, and those horrific combat wounds, the pirate story becomes a lot less of a fairy tale and much more of a gripping, tragic human history. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning the history you think you know.